She was giggling when I walked in, that affected, tinkling giggle she used to telegraph charm she didn't possess, surrounded by flickering tapers and brimming wine goblets and faces as foreign to me as Martian landscapes. She tilted her head back as if she hadn't decreed 5 years prior that I should excise myself from her existence. And then her gaze snagged on mine, her pupils dilated, swallowing the light. A crimson tide receded from her countenance, leaving it ashen. The champagne flute slipped through her nerveless fingers, shattering against the mosaic floor. A hush fell, heavier than velvet. For a handful of heartbeats, time itself seemed to falter, as if I'd breached the fabric of reality. "Bella," she whispered, then louder, "Bella." And then her knees buckled. I remained impassive, a sentinel in the same drab olive coat I'd worn on my exodus half a decade ago, watching her collapse like a broken puppet. Her new groom, yes, groom, surged to her side, bellowing her name as if it held some talismanic power. But it was hollow now. For 5 years I had been a nonentity, unlamented, unsearched for, unspoken. I had dematerialized, at her behest. She'd delivered the words like a benediction. "Please, Bella, vanish. You're spoiling everything." And I had complied. I had vanished. No missing person report, no digital footprint, not a single, "Are you still alive?" She hadn't sought me out because she hadn't desired to, confident that I was too pliant to defy her. And perhaps she was correct. But tonight was not about exacting vengeance. I wasn't here to unleash recriminations or entreaties. I was simply here to return something. And what I retrieved from my coat pocket at that precise moment, as the paramedics scrambled in, was destined to shatter the carefully constructed edifice she'd been building for half a decade. Not even her newly acquired surname could shield her. I stood my ground as they raised her from the floor. Someone proffered a towel, presuming I'd been splashed by the spilled champagne. I declined. I merely clutched the envelope, its corner subtly creased where my grip had tightened during the taxi ride. It was inconsequential. Its contents remained undisturbed, and when the moment arrived, she would unveil them. She had no alternative. They roused her to consciousness before the arrival of the ambulance. She sat upright, disoriented, her eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape route. But I was no longer stationed in the doorway. I had retreated just far enough to blend into the throng, present but inconspicuous, precisely as she had always preferred me, barely perceptible. The man kneeling beside her, her spouse, fiancé, consort, whatever his designation, queried one of the other women about her collapse. The woman attributed it to shock, but the way Bella's gaze swept the room, frantically seeking and failing to locate me, suggested a different etiology. It wasn't the passage of time that had unhinged her. It was the stark realization that I still persisted. She had fabricated this gleaming, immaculate existence. Pristine lines, couture gowns, forced laughter. Everything she had ever craved, and devoid of any trace of me. I was an interloper. But that's precisely what rendered it perfect. Because occasionally, the most indelible entrance is the one they pray never materializes. I slipped away unnoticed. No histrionics, no confrontation, not yet. My objective was not to detonate. I was here to insinuate myself into her psyche, a weight she thought she had permanently shed, and I knew she would pursue me. She invariably did when she felt her dominion threatened. By midnight, I was ensconced in a dingy motel room 2 cities removed, reeking of disinfectant and stale tobacco. I lay recumbent on the bed, still fully attired, fixating on the envelope resting on the nightstand. It was unremarkable. No inscription, no return address, merely her name inscribed in my hand. Within resided a single photograph and a handwritten note, one vestige of the past and one immutable truth. In the epoch of our marriage, we had frequented a cabin nestled near Harker Lake. No room service, no diversions, just quietude, frigid air, and unspoken falsehoods. The photograph originated from that locale, a snapshot she never suspected I had retained. A picture of her and the man I subsequently discovered had been a fixture in her life before she commanded me to vanish. The photograph alone would not annihilate her, but the accompanying note would. It was not a threat, devoid of demands, merely a solitary sentence. You left a trail that never ceased bleeding. She would grasp its import, and she would recognize that I had not merely returned. I had never genuinely departed. It was shortly after 2 o'clock a.m. when I heard the summons at the door. Not the perfunctory knock one anticipates at lodging establishments. Timid, tentative, apologetic. No, this was frenetic, arrhythmic, as if the knocker were half daring herself to proceed. I did not rise immediately. I desired her to persist. I desired her to experience the silence she had once inflicted upon me. 3 more iterations, then a pause, then her voice. "Bella, I know you're in there." I opened the portal deliberately, nonchalantly, and there she stood, Willow, cloaked in an overcoat unfamiliar to me, suffused with a panic I knew intimately. Her hair was disheveled, as if she'd raked her fingers through it countless times en route. Her mascara was smeared beneath her eyes, not from weeping, but from perspiration, from flight. She advanced as if to embrace me, but I remained stationary. "Where did you go?" she inquired, as if the query hadn't aged 5 years. "You instructed me to dematerialize," I responded. "And I did. I didn't intend like that. But you did," I interjected evenly. "You articulated it unequivocally, as if it were a final directive." Her gaze darted past me, surveying the motel room, seeking clues to my transformation. She would discover little: a duffel bag, a disposable cellular device, the envelope she had already breached, or a facsimile thereof, displayed face up on the table, her eyes fastened on it. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why are you inflicting this upon me?" The hypocrisy was galling. She had consigned me to oblivion, effaced me with a mere utterance, and now she stood here, in the dead of night, querying my motives for reappearing. "You fainted," I remarked. "That was not insignificant." She swallowed audibly. Her voice dropped. "I wasn't anticipating seeing you." "You presumed I had ceased to exist." Her silence was my affirmation, and that silence ushered in something novel: trepidation. I stepped aside. She remained rooted, fixating on the photograph as if it might lash out. "You retained that picture," she said. "Long enough to ascertain his identity," I retorted. Her entire visage altered. "Willow, listen. That photograph doesn't signify what you presume it does, but the name does, doesn't it? Gideon Hayes." She recoiled as if struck. Gideon Hayes, the man she had portrayed as merely a former colleague from the agency, the one who had purportedly reached out once post-divorce to extend congratulations. The man I subsequently learned had transferred $500,000 into a trust established 2 years before our separation. Her mouth opened, but words eluded her. She was attempting to calculate which falsehood would inflict the least damage. That was her modus operandi, never the truth. Merely the version of reality most conducive to safeguarding her image. "I am apprised of the property in Bar Harbor," I continued. "I am cognizant of the fictitious consulting firm. I am aware of the accounts utilized to conceal the transfer. And I know the vacation snapshots you disseminated from Aspen were actually from Oaxaca, Mexico, because he possesses a conspicuous birthmark on his wrist, visible from multiple angles." She attempted to interject, but I persisted. "I vanished, Willow, but you forgot that ghosts possess the faculty of observation." She turned toward the corridor, trembling but not weeping. Not yet. But the tremor that presages the recognition that truth isn't merely knocking at your door, but already ensconced on your bed, awaiting acknowledgement. "What do you desire from me?" she finally inquired, devoid of anger, merely consumed by fear. I retreated into the room and retrieved a second envelope. "Nothing," I stated. "This one is not intended for you. It is destined for him." Her eyes widened. "You intend to engage with Gideon?" "No," I corrected. "I already have." And with that, I slammed the door shut. I had no need to confront Gideon Hayes in person. Not out of apprehension, that facet of me had perished years ago, but because I grasped a concept Willow never had. Silence leaves deeper scars than confrontation. She craved to dictate the narrative, but I had finally mastered the art of crafting my own, discreetly, precisely, and with impeccable timing. The envelope I dispatched to Gideon did not contain menaces or invective, merely 4 items: a photograph of him and Willow at that coastal dwelling in Bar Harbor, the same one she had represented as her aunt's retreat years ago, a notarized affidavit from a forensic accountant I had engaged the previous year, detailing the movement of funds between 3 shell corporations they jointly controlled, a copy of our antiquated marriage certificate, legally binding us to joint assets that had never been dissolved, and, lastly, a brief letter stating simply, "She promised me liberation. Instead, she entombed me alive. Ask her how many other identities she's eradicated." That letter was delivered personally to the address they never suspected I would uncover. I sought nothing, no money, no apologies, just knowledge. I desired Gideon to perceive the same portrait of her that had haunted me for too long, a woman who curated her existence with surgical precision, excising anything that diminished her sense of power. 3 days elapsed without communication. No calls from Willow, no summons at my motel door, just a silence so pervasive it possessed weight, a palpable pressure under which one could suffocate. Sleep was elusive. I watched static on the television screen, contemplating which aspect of her life was crumbling first. Then, on the 4th morning, I received a text from an unrecognized number, devoid of greeting, devoid of emojis, merely 5 words. "He left. What did you do?" It was Willow. I fixated on the screen, permitting the question to linger like smoke. I delayed my response, desiring her to experience the same desolation I had known years prior, cradling a cup of tepid coffee, wondering when I had ceased to matter to the woman across from me. I composed a single sentence and transmitted it. "You instructed me to disappear. This is its manifestation." 2 hours later, she stood outside my motel once more. No overcoat, no affectation, merely denim, a black sweater, and the countenance of someone whose mirror had finally refused to perpetuate falsehoods. Her cosmetics were gone, as was her jewelry, and she appeared diminished in some intangible manner. She did not wait for an invitation. She bypassed me and sat on the edge of the bed, as she used to do when mustering the courage to deliver a cruel truth. Except this time, her voice faltered. "He said he didn't know about the house. She said he thinks I tricked him. He asked me if I did the same thing to you." I remained quiescent, as she halted and swallowed. "He left. I stayed silent." She looked up. "Why now, Bella? Why, after all this time? Why return merely to obliterate me?" It would have been facile to attribute it to revenge, but the truth was more prosaic and more terrifying. "I did not return to obliterate you," I declared. "I returned to cease pretending I never existed." She scrutinized me for a prolonged interval, and then, for the first time in half a decade, she articulated something unexpected. "I deemed you feeble, but now I scarcely recognize you." I did not flinch. "That is because you never genuinely perceived me. You merely perceived what rendered it easier for you to be." And then I presented her with the final envelope, the one containing the legal documents she never suspected I possessed, the silent insurance I had maintained for all these years, power of attorney forms executed prior to my disappearance, deeds she had neglected to update, digital fingerprints she thought had been erased. She opened it with trembling hands. Her lips quivered, and when she finally raised her gaze to mine, her expression was not one of anger, but of stark terror. "You could ruin me," she whispered. I rose, retrieved my coat, proceeded to the door, and spoke the words destined to haunt her forever. I already did. Then I abandoned her with everything she had endeavored to forget, and what transpired subsequently defied all expectations. I anticipated her to flee, to weep, to entreat, to summon her legal counsel. I did not anticipate silence, not for 2 days. And it was not the tranquility of serenity, but of surgical precision, as if she were strategically biding her time. So I waited, not at the motel. I had abandoned that behind the moment I relinquished the documents. I drove inland, seeking a sanctuary where I would be least likely to be discovered. I craved air, space. I did not merely desire to distance myself from Willow, but from the persona I had briefly inhabited, the one who believed that returning would engender release. It had not. It had merely amplified the cacophony. But she still found me. The telltale hum of the engine was the first sign. I was ensconced in an antiquated farmhouse near the periphery of an obscure Vermont town, the kind of place where trees outnumbered inhabitants and cellular signals ceased functioning after 8:00 p.m. I was outside, splitting wood, when I heard the subtle crunch of tires on gravel, slow, deliberate. She emerged from the driver's seat as if she had rehearsed this entrance 100 times. Meticulous hair, sunglasses, a serene expression incongruous on someone whose world had just imploded. I remained silent. She brooked no preliminaries. "There is something you fail to comprehend," she asserted. "Gideon did not depart merely because of your envelope." I arched an eyebrow, but remained quiescent. She continued, "He departed because I instructed him to. I needed to gauge whether you would pursue him or me. I needed to ascertain who you were now." Tom. I did not respond, not out of speechlessness, but because I sensed a shift, something amiss, as if I had opened a portal and realized the room within was not uninhabited. "You presume you have been in control of this, Abigail?" she said softly, "but you are only here now because I permitted it." It wasn't merely the words, but the manner in which they were delivered. She was devoid of anger, devoid of desperation, merely measuring me. That was when I perceived it. She had not collapsed at the party out of fear, but because I had arrived too soon, because I had disrupted something that had yet to reach its culmination. I took a step backward. She followed. "While you were preoccupied with vanishing," she went on, "I was constructing something. Not with Gideon. He was merely a source of funds. That house, those accounts, they were merely the facade. You are ignorant of what lies beneath, Abigail. You never inquired." And that was when it struck me. I had been so fixated on exacting revenge, on reclaiming my identity, that I had inadvertently walked into the second trap she had been laying all along. Not for Gideon, not for some novel existence, but for me. "You didn't merely desire me gone," I said. "You desired me forgotten." She smiled, almost imperceptibly. "Because you were the only element I could not control, and now, even after 5 years, you are still here, still haunting me." I felt my throat constrict. The wind intensified behind us. Leaves danced around our feet, as if cognizant of the unraveling occurring before us. "So why are you here?" I asked. "What is the genuine motive?" She extracted a folded piece of parchment from her coat and extended it to me. A name, a location, a set of coordinates. "I am presenting you with a choice," she said. "Proceed there, or continue this game. But should you choose the latter, I promise you that what you perceive as revenge will become your cage." And then she turned on her heel, entered the vehicle, and drove away. I unfolded the parchment with trembling hands. It was not merely a location, it was a cemetery. And beneath the coordinates, she had inscribed 3 words. She never existed. I do not subscribe to omens, but that drive felt cursed from its inception. My navigation system failed to load the coordinates Willow had furnished. compelling me to rely on an antiquated road atlas I discovered in the farmhouse. Every page emitted the scent of mildew and forsaken places. The air grew heavier the farther north I ventured, the kind of quietude that insinuates itself into your ears and lingers behind your ribs. I reached the cemetery midday, a neglected patch of land sandwiched between the woods and an abandoned railway track, comprising no more than 30 headstones, mostly crumbling, askew, and eroded by decades of exposure. There was no signage, no path, no maintenance, merely the overpowering sensation that time had ceased here and never resumed. But one grave stood apart, newer, pristine, adorned with recent floral tributes, still imbued with their fragrance. The stone was alabaster and unblemished, polished so smoothly I could discern my reflection in its surface. I knelt to decipher the inscription. Hazel Jane Blackwood, 1989, 2016, beloved daughter, missed but never forgotten. My heart seized, not because I recognized the name, but because I did not, and because the photograph affixed to the stone, one of those circular ceramic portraits, depicted a younger rendition of Willow. The same bone structure, the same eyes, the same mouth, but a different name, a different identity. And according to this marker, she had perished 6 years prior, 1 year before she commanded me to vanish. For several minutes, I merely stared, a sensation I couldn't name crawling across my shoulders. I glanced about, half expecting her to be standing nearby, observing, poised to offer some explanation, but there was nothing. Only the soughing of the wind through the trees and the low, distant rumble of a freight train long out of service. I photographed the stone. Back in the vehicle, I scrutinized public death records via my hotspot. The obituary was authentic, duly published and recorded. A woman named Hazel Jane Blackwood had indeed perished in an automobile accident in upstate New York, except she hadn't. She'd become my wife. Willow, or Hazel, or whatever her true designation was, had married me less than a year after that date, under an entirely different alias, utilizing forged documentation, a concealed identity. I could not fully decipher it yet, but one thing was clear. I had not merely married a liar, I had married someone who was not supposed to exist anymore. And I began to speculate if I had ever genuinely known the person who had once whispered the word disappear as if it were an act of mercy. Back at the farmhouse that evening, I pored over every document I possessed: bank statements, digital trails, scans of antiquated correspondence she had authored. I even summoned our wedding photos, zooming in on the attendees, her gown, the signature on the certificate. Everything. Every element suddenly seemed precarious, as if the foundation of the house I had been residing in was merely a tarp concealing a sinkhole. But what chilled me most was not her name, or the grave, or the falsified history, but the growing realization that her need for me to vanish had nothing to do with heartbreak or betrayal. It had to do with survival. She needed me gone because I was the last person alive who might recognize her for who she truly was. And perhaps, now, she realized that threat hadn't remained buried. My burner phone buzzed shortly after midnight, displaying no caller ID. I answered regardless. Her voice was subdued, almost defeated. "Abigail, please. You were not intended to discover that." I offered no reply. She persisted. "I am not who you think I am. I never was, but I am not the antagonist here. If you continue to delve, you will place more than yourself at risk. Just permit it to die." I posed the only query that mattered. Who was she? There was a pause, not for dramatic effect, but for fear. Then came her response. "She was me, but I eliminated her. And if you continue to tug at the thread, someone will come seeking what remains." The line went dead, and in that moment, gazing at my reflection in the farmhouse window, I no longer recognized the man staring back. Sleep was no longer a viable option. I devoted the entirety of the night to sifting through antiquated emails, login credentials, digital folders I had not accessed in years. Every file bearing her name, or names, I should say, I copied to an encrypted drive. I was no longer certain what I was safeguarding. Myself, the truth, some fading vestige of love I had yet to relinquish. By morning, I possessed one clear lead. There was a storage unit registered in her name. Not Willow, not Hazel, but under a third identity I had unearthed within a shared Dropbox folder from 2017. It was registered under the name Clara Hill, located just outside a sleepy industrial hamlet called Arling Ridge, 5 hours south. The lease had been on autopay ever since. I drove non-stop. The facility was encircled by dilapidated fencing and abutted a row of warehouses with faded signage that had outlived their purpose. The manager scarcely glanced at me when I presented the forged identification I had prepared the previous night to match the records. I had anticipated questions. There were none. Unit number 427, second floor, south wing. The metal door screeched as it rolled. Upward. The air within was arid and stale, but not untouched. Someone had been here recently. The unit was meticulously organized, not the haphazard accumulation one anticipates in such a space. No antiquated furniture, no stacks of boxes collapsing from age, merely containers lining the walls, each meticulously labeled with a city and a date. I opened one, Denver 2013. Inside, passports. 2 of them, both bearing her likeness, both under different names, one expired, one active. Portland 2014. Burner phones, dozens, all deactivated, some still in their original packaging. One bore a sticky note, compromised. Tucson 2015. A journal. That was the first time I hesitated. I opened it slowly. Her handwriting was slanted, neat, compulsive. The initial entry was dated 6 months prior to our first encounter. There is no turning back now. They think Hazel is dead. That buys me 2, perhaps 3 years. But if anyone from the firm tracks me, I will need a clean exit. Avoid emotional ties. No attachments. I reread that sentence repeatedly, struggling to fathom its weight. She had not merely lied to me. She had orchestrated an entire second, perhaps third, identity. And I was not the only one she had vanished from. Who were they? What firm? What event transpired in 2016 that compelled her to fake her demise and re-enter existence under a new moniker? I continued reading. Entry after entry, I witnessed the woman I had married unraveling into something colder, more calculating. About 3/4 of the way through, one name reappeared consistently. Silas. I did not know who Silas was, but his name surfaced repeatedly in notes and warnings underlined in red ink. Silas has leverage. If he resurfaces, I will need to burn the original files and eliminate the low variable. I stared at those words, numb, the low variable. I had not been a husband in her estimation, merely a liability, a term in an equation that needed to be subtracted. I do not recall leaving the unit. My limbs moved of their own accord. The journal remained in my grasp when I reached the vehicle. I sat there for what must have been an hour, observing the sky morph from gray to something darker, clouds swirling like smoke above the rooftops. Then my phone vibrated. It was an image transmitted from an unrecognized number, a photograph of me, taken from behind, standing in front of the storage unit no more than 15 minutes prior. No message, merely the image. Then another, this time depicting Willow standing in front of what appeared to be a high-rise building I did not recognize. She was engaged in conversation with someone whose face was partially obscured, pale shaved head, a tattoo behind his ear. The caption read simply, "You were never." Watching her, we were watching you. My chest constricted, my breath became shallow. I glanced back at the storage unit, the interior light illuminated, the metal door I had locked slowly rolling open, again. That door should have remained closed, but it did not. The metal screeched as it ascended, my heart pounding in my ears. I could not discern who was inside, merely the silhouette of a man standing motionless in the fluorescent glow, backlit and silent. I did not wait for him to speak. I entered my vehicle and drove, for hours, until I crossed the state line and reached the cabin, the one I had believed I would never revisit, the one Willow and I had frequented during quiet winters, back when I had mistakenly equated silence with safety. It was time-worn now, but still standing, and for once I did not feel haunted by its presence. I incinerated the journal that night in the hearth. Page by page, I watched every alias, every plan, every threat curl into smoke, not out of fear, but because I was finished carrying it. I did not need to comprehend every detail, did not need every fragment of the puzzle to slot into place, because occasionally, peace is not knowing why something transpired. It is merely knowing that it is finished. The following morning, I made a decision. I contacted a federal investigator quietly, anonymously, relinquishing every file I had in my possession pertaining to the shell companies, the fake identities, the laundering schemes, and the digital trails she had neglected to fully erase. Not to injure her, not to expose her, but because someone needed to know, someone trustworthy. I relinquished it thereafter, ceasing to look over my shoulder, ceasing to delve into shadows. I changed my number, reverted to my given name, Abigail Blake, and for the first time in years, I ceased disappearing from myself. And as for Willow, I heard she had left the country, not fleeing, not vanishing, merely relocating somewhere coastal where questions were unasked. Perhaps she assumed another identity, perhaps not, but she stayed gone, and that in some intangible manner was sufficient. The silence was no longer empty, it was earned. 1 year later, I opened a small bookstore by a lake. Nothing extravagant, merely used books, local authors, coffee that exceeded expectations. Some describe me as reserved, some as melancholic. But I am no longer sad, merely grateful, because in a world where individuals are erased without leaving even fingerprints, I survived. And, somewhere deep within the static of those 5 lost years, I rediscovered myself, not as her husband, not as her variable, merely as me. And that, after everything, is the most felicitous conclusion I could have envisioned.